When we think of power creep, we think of the monstrous new offensive Pokemon moves and what we have added each generation, which we have covered in our previous video. The reason we think of power creep exclusively as an offensive phenomenon is natural. When you think of power, you think of the flashiest, strongest Pokemon around whose offensive prowess shapes and defines the metagame. Your Choice Specs Latios Draco Meteors, your Sun Boosted Mega Charizard Y Fire Blast, your Twinkle Tackle Magirinas. However, power creep is very much not just exclusively an offensive phenomenon. It may not be as immediately noticeable in most cases, but defensive power creep is very much a thing. And it's been around a lot longer and in more subtle forms than the Toxapex that might have sprung to your mind. It's also highly necessary. After all, without it, how would we withstand the new, potentially overwhelming beast Game Freak constantly sees fit to unleash? Today, we're going to explore that which holds the metagame together against offensive power creep. And so, we ask, how good was defensive power creep actually? And also defend yourself from power creep, because once again, this video sponsor is Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a virtual private network and browser extension that allows you to place your computer or phone virtually in any country as if you're actually there. Surfshark has 3,200 plus servers in 65 countries. A VPN or virtual private network keeps you safe and private by covering up your internet activity. All that information is encrypted. Think of it like the information is simply blurred out if someone tries to peek. And this comes especially handy when you're doing something like traveling, for example. When I travel, I make sure to watch my spending so I don't get carried away, but checking my bank account on a public network isn't the best idea. But with one click of a button, Surfshark encrypts my data and I can check safely if I'm near my spending limit. And of course, if you want access to more content on your favorite streaming service, you can connect to one of Surfshark's many servers and connect to different countries to watch their catalog instead. Or if you're traveling outside of the US, you can connect to the US from there to watch American Netflix too. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can use my promo code FALLSWIPE or click the link in the description below and get Surfshark VPN for 83% off and 3 extra months for free. Defensive power creep has been around ever since the first generational shift in Gold and Silver. As a response to the obscene dominance of Gen 1 Psychic types, 2 new types were added, Steel and Dark, which resisted and were immune to Psychic, respectively. We can take this time to define defensive power creep as that which is used for defensive purposes more often than not. Steel and Dark were not added for their offensive prowess at all. Steel's type coverage and stab moves were meager, while Dark was better but still not exactly a metagame wrecker in its own right. Steel was also an outstanding example of defensive power creep by virtue of its resistance to the other type that had dominated Generation 1, Normal. This was particularly valuable given that Self-Destruct and Explosion had just had their power strengthened. And now, as an example of what wouldn't qualify as defensive power creep, yes, Spikes and Toxic were useful for defensive teams, but they were just as valuable as offensive weapons. In addition to Psychic and Normal, Steel's myriad other resistances were of course useful as well, but they would prove more valuable in more powerful, resistance-based metagames of the generations to follow, as opposed to Gen 2's significant focus on pure bulk. In a similar instance, Generation 2 also added an incredible defensive power creep move in Protect, which wouldn't have much impact in Gen 2, but would become one of defensive teams' greatest weapons in combating offense as soon as the following generation, with the increased focus on passive damage. Generation 2 also made it easier to withstand hits over the course of the game with the addition of Sleep Talk, which could still effectively call rest, as opposed to later generations in which it would fail to do so. This made bulky walls. The addition of Heal Bell also cured an entire team of status, which was superb for helping combat offensive teams who focus on spreading paralysis or toxic in order to generate opportunities for their threats. Now, of course, we must also mention the amazing walls, the paragons of pure bulk added in Generation 2. Skarmory, Umbreon, Suicune, Miltank, and of course Chansey's evolution, Blissey. Generation 3's defensive power creep largely focused on increased longevity, which was critical for bulky teams to keep up in the face of the aforementioned increase in passive damage, as well as the far more powerful hits that were now being thrown around. A significantly buffed Leech Seed made it an excellent defensive-offensive move, acting as a source of healing while still actively dealing with the opponent. The natural cure ability was incredible for shrugging off the heavily spammed Toxic without needing to use Heal Bell or Rest. In fact, one just had to switch out to activate it. Natural cure was a huge part of what made Celebi, Blissey, and bulky Starmie so seemingly unkillable at times. In a similar vein, the addition of Refresh, meant Pokemon like Milotic could combat their own weakness to Toxic without resorting to Rest or a teammate with Heal Bell. Gen 3 also added a unique, incredible defensive power creep move in Wish. With it, Pokemon could heal their teammates directly. Skarmory didn't have recovery in Generation 3, but when paired with Wish Blissey, it hardly mattered. Skarm would come in against a Pokemon that had switched into Bliss and find itself healed up. Skarm also compensated for its lack of a reliable recovery by spamming the daylights out of Protect to maximize leftovers, as did another key wall in Advance, Swampert. Finally, Gen 3 also added a new recovery move in Slack Off. While this wasn't of much use then, it would become an incredibly important piece of defense just a generation later when utilized by Hippowdon, as well as Slowbro and Slowking in Generations 5 and later, once they gained Regenerator to accentuate it, though they'd already begun showing their stuff with just Slack Off in Gen 4's lower tiers. Gen 3 also added several excellent defensive Pokemon. In addition to the aforementioned Swampert and Milotic, the likes of Claydol and bulky variants of Jirachi and Flygon were also key. Generation 4's addition of more entry hazards in Stealth Rock and Toxic Spikes was, by definition, not defensive power creep, since offensive teams used them effectively too. However, it did increase the ability to use phasing moves as fairly powerful offensive attacks with several layers down, and defensive teams use phasing moves far more often than offensive ones. Thus, we can consider this a form of defensive power creep, as this defensive-offensive method was akin to Leech Seed in how it allowed defensive teams to deal with offensive ones while still actively dealing with the opponent. Hail could be considered in a similar vein, as it was far more often used by defensive teams attempting to put offensive teams on a timer. Though Gen 4 saw the halving of recovery PP from 32 to 16, it also added an amazing new recovery move in Roost. Finally, Skarmory was able to heal itself reliably, not needing Rest or Protect or a Wish passing teammate. It wasn't just Skarm using the move to reliable walling effect either. It was also many others, most notably Bulky Zapdos and Gliscor. Gliscor itself could be considered defensive power creep in its own right. Such an upgrade it was from the promising but underwhelming Gligar. In a similar vein, though Tangrowth didn't have too significant an impact on Generation 4, its addition would prove significant later on. Generation 4 also added several other outstanding defensive Pokemon. In addition to the aforementioned Hippowdon, Bronzong also proved itself one of the most perennial obnoxious walls to take down, as did the Rotom appliances upon the release of Pokemon Platinum. Finally, Generation 4 created perhaps the most perfect defensive ability of all time, besides the obviously broken if they put it on anything decent Wonder Guard. Magic Guard, whose capacity for brokenness really doesn't seem far beyond its wondrous counterpart, seeing as it single-handedly turned Clefable from defensively unimpressive into one of the most infuriatingly unkillable Pokemon in a game for some of the most powerful offensive threats around. Finally, Generation 4 is actually where the Unaware ability came into existence, though it was only available to Bidoof and Bibarel, and this didn't see any use. It would of course become incredibly important just a generation later. Generation 5 is justly famous for its astonishing levels of offensive power creep, but its defensive power creep was hugely important as well. Much of what was newly added was key in holding the tier together in the face of these nightmarishly new monsters. Sandrush Extra Drill, Speed Boost Blaziken, Hydro Pumps boosted by Permanent Rain, the list goes on and on. If there's anything that can rival Magic Guard, it's Regenerator. In such a hard-hitting, fast-paced metagame where every turn is crucial, sometimes even taking a turn to manually heal could leave one falling behind in the constant uphill battle that was withstanding the endless cascading barrage of offensive threats. Thus, Regen's ability to heal just by switching out was absolutely incredible. It compensated for Tangrowth's lack of reliable healing, since Synthesis didn't count in a metagame of permanent weather, but it didn't even need it, whereas before it'd take 1 or 2 hits, then be too weakened to do so again, making it unreliable in the long term. Now it'd take a hit, switch out, and be pretty much just as unscathed as it was before, especially when it added nice residual healing for itself in Leech Seed and the buffed Giga Drain. Regenerator also made Slowbro utterly superb. Yes, it could heal itself through Slack Off, but the fact that it didn't have to do so to heal itself meant it could actually retaliate against the opponent without missing out on its all-important health. This made it much more annoying to switch into with Scalds, Thunder Waves, and such, and thus allowed the defensive teams using it to more reliably match the pace of the offensive teams they were facing off against, as opposed to being purely passive and exploitable. In Black and White 2, the previously mediocre Amoonguss also gained Regenerator and became a key piece of OU in staving off monsters like Keldeo and Technician Breloom. Generation 5's distributor of hidden abilities, the Dream World, which blessed the likes of Tangrowth and Slowbro with Regenerator, bestowed plenty of other amazing defensive abilities on Pokemon that came to be critical defensive pieces of the metagame as a result. Upon receiving Unaware, Quagsire became an incredible wall in the face of the monstrous physical boosters that terrorized so much of the metagame. It stifled Dragon Dance Dragonite and most of the metagame's Swords Dancers like Excadrill, Terrakion, Scizor, and Gliscor. Speaking of Gliscor, it was also one of the metagame's best, most prominent physical walls by virtue of receiving Poison Heal as its ability. Its ability to passively heal so much HP per turn not only helped it withstand hits better, but also allowed it to take a more active role in striking back at the opponent rather than taking turns to heal, going along with the aforementioned style of active defense that was similarly enabled by Regenerator. Not fearing status, most notably burns from Heatran's Lava Plume, was also a significant boost. Rain was most famous for its offensive boost, but one of its most irritating signature Pokemon, Tentacruel, received an absolutely incredible piece of defensive power creep in Rain Dish, which turned it into one of the best Pokemon in the game under Rain. It was downright unkillable. It was useful on all types of Rain, but was the backbone of Rain Stall in particular, a playstyle which had the metagame in a chokehold for some time. It goes to show just how huge defensive power creep was that so many bulky playstyles thrived through so much of the generation. Rain Stall utilizing Jirachi, Blissey, or Chansey also reaped the benefits of another new piece of defensive power creep, new Wish mechanics, which instead of healing the recipient by a flat 50%, now healed by 50% of the Wish user's health. Since Jirachi, Blissey, and Chansey had higher HP stats than the Pokemon they were passing wishes to, the Pokemon receiving their wishes would heal more than half their HP. In the Pink Blob's case, with their HP stats over 700, bestowing wishes over 350 HP. They would commonly be healing their teammates all the way up to full. Speaking of defensive power creep, why Chansey when Blissey had been the OU staple since Generation 2? Because of another piece of Gen 5 power creep, that's why, Eviolite, which boosted the defenses of unevolved Pokemon by 50%. Speaking of Rain, Gastrodon had already had Storm Drain in Generation 4, but the ability was useless in singles. However, in Generation 5, the ability was buffed to provide its users a water immunity and a special attack boost upon being hit by a water type move. The water immunity was absolutely incredible in a metagame overflowing with rain boosted Hydro Pumps, while Gastrodon's typing also made it a prime counter to another immensely broken threat, Thundurus. We haven't even mentioned the excellent new defensive Pokemon introduced in Generation 5 itself. Ferrothorn and Jellicent were instant hits, with Ferrothorn's Iron Barbs allowing offense to be played while on defense. In a similar vein, the addition of Rocky Helmet helped stave off big attacks as well, and was particularly popular on Skarmory. Gen 5's addition of Reuniclus, Alomomola, and the aforementioned Amoonguss once to receive Regenerator was also key. Amoonguss was also the recipient of an excellent new move, Clear Smog, whose stat clearing effect while remaining an attack and thus untauntable would be more key in the subsequent generation. Finally, the addition of Magic Bounce would be more important in later generations, but even in Gen 5, it saw some use on certain Sunstalls. Seeing how much it was power crept on both offense and defense, Gen 5 really was the generation of excess. Generation 6's defensive power creep wasn't quite as extreme as Generation 5. How could any generation match that? But it was significant nonetheless. Now, at first you'd think the Fairy type is incredible defensive power creep, and Fairy's amazing defensive typing certainly was helpful for bulky playstyles and teams, giving them easy outs to the dragon spam that had previously been overwhelming. However, Fairy was also a threatening offensive typing, so it doesn't quite count as pure defensive power creep. Apart from that, what immediately jumped out is the Fog, which was of course amazing. Now, bulky teams had more recourse for dealing with hazards, whereas in previous generations they had at times struggled to withstand the combined assault of big threats in conjunction with hazards. Speaking of dealing with hazards, Oraz's addition of Mega Sableye and its Magic Bounce was similarly irritating, so much so that Mega Sableye was eventually banned. Imagine that, a defensive Pokemon banned. That's a singular piece of defensive power creep even Gen 5 couldn't match. However, equally important was the nerfing of weather abilities. Without permanent weather, many threats were far easier to handle. Bulky teams had an easier time withstanding them when several Pokemon weren't constantly dug into by Sandstorm or taking water hits that wouldn't always be boosted by rain. Additionally, the base powers of several key offensive moves were nerfed. All of Draco Meteor, Fire Blast, Hydro Pump, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, Flamethrower, and Hidden Power were weakened and thus even easier to withstand. These changes allowed stall teams to more easily leverage Regenerator and Unaware to stifle common offenses. forces. In spite of the powerful new megas possessing occasionally unprecedented levels of threat, these pieces of defensive power creep allowed bulky teams and defense to absolutely thrive as Generation 6 progressed, to the point where the playstyle's efficiency was cause for complaint. Generation 7 exacerbated the defensive power creep on display in Gen 6. The widespread addition of Defog made hazards even easier to clear, helped out by the return of Mega Sableye, and of course the addition of one of the most incredible defensive Pokemon in the game, the famous Regenerator spamming Toxapex. It was the same issue that had been on display in Generation 6, amped up severely, and thus the style maintained powerful metagame presence to the point of being considered by many to be overpowered even in the face of the brutally powerful new Z moves. Then in Generation 8, the concept of regenning and underwearing until the opponent was too exhausted to continue was taken to its apex. The removal of Megas and Z crystals meant threats were even easier to withstand hits from, while the addition of heavy-duty boots made dealing with hazards even easier. With offensive tactics neutered, previously manageable defensive power creep became increasingly difficult to deal with. As a result, defense and bulk has thrived throughout Generation 8. So in conclusion, though we think of power creep as that thing Game Freak does to try and impress us with previously non-existent levels of damage dealt, it's also important to notice the subtler ways power creep is added, that of defense. It makes dealing with it easier. Generation 9 has looked to bestow a whole host of monstrous offense to the game, but don't be fooled. Once the dust settles, it's almost certain that defensive improvements will come to be significant pieces of the metagame as well. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about defensive power creep? Was there anything we missed? Is there any other types of videos you'd like to see? And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.